Thank you very much, and welcome back, everyone. Welcome to this next session. So obviously we've had lots of fantastic sessions today on responsible recruitment, but in this session we're really going to delve into how we're responding to risk, and specifically how industry is collaborating on that risk. For those of you who have not had the chance to meet yet, my name is Bethan and I'm the UK Programmes Manager at Stronger Together, one of the partners at this event. So I look after two of our collaborative programmes. The first is the UK Consumer Goods Programme, working with businesses to take action against modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. The second programme is of particular relevance to our conference today, and that is the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit, which we launched in 2018. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's a capacity building and online self-assessment tool, and businesses can self-assess against 14 standards and one overarching management approach. And these standards are mapped against best practice, many which have come up in our discussions throughout the 2 days, including the DACA principles, which we discussed yesterday. And we now have over 3,000 subscribers. And the tool it's internationally applicable, it's sector neutral, and there is some contextualized guidance for the US, Mexico, and Costa Rica for the agricultural sectors. And businesses can also connect to one another within the tool, so you're able to see partners' progress against those standards that I just mentioned. And if anyone is interested, please do kind of come and grab me over lunch. I've got a bit of information here. And for those of you joining online, please feel free to have a Google of the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit to learn more. And throughout the session, we'll be highlighting other responsible recruitment tools. So we'll be keeping this session in the theme of practical kind of actions that businesses can take. So I've got three fantastic speakers with me in person today. We're all in person. So first up, I'm joined by James Mallick, Director at Fruitful Jobs. And next up, we have Henriette McCool, who's the Social and Innovation and Human Rights Manager at Vinci. And then in the middle here, we are joined by Deeva. She's the Human Rights and Due Diligence Officer at the UK retailer Waitrose. Just a quick note on how we're going to structure the session. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists an opening question. And then we're going to have kind of roughly 15 minutes to build on these opening statements, kind of really get into those similarities, differences, and the lessons that have been learned along the way. And then I'm factoring about kind of 10 minutes for audience questions. So really encourage you to start firing those in as we go through. And then fingers crossed we'll have time for kind of quick fire closing remarks from everyone as well. So, James, you're up first. So our first question is, what were the new risks that emerged in the UK seasonal worker scheme that the UK horticulture sector identified? And how did industry collaborate and respond to these risks?
Maybe just setting the scene of the UK seasonal worker scheme just very briefly first. I think we touched on it yesterday. Not everyone in the room and maybe watching online is fully aware of the scheme. It's a seasonal worker visa scheme that enables 45,000 workers to come into the UK to work in agriculture with the ability to return year on year. The scheme was set up initially in 2019 and kind of things were pretty good for the first couple of years around a pilot. The reason for the scheme was Brexit and the loss of EU freedom of movement, which the agricultural industry was heavily reliant on. In 22, there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And at that time, 66% of workers in the seasonal worker scheme were coming from Ukraine. And that represented about 20,000 individuals. As a result of that situation, many of those workers either weren't able or willing to return, quite understandably, but it also prevented any new recruitment. And so as scheme operators, and I'll touch just very quickly on what scheme operators do, we had to shift very quickly to new source countries. So in terms of what a scheme operator does, because I think that's quite nuanced in terms of a visa scheme and not necessarily commonplace, we're not just the recruiter. So we are doing the things that you would expect us to do as a recruiter in terms of sourcing labour, making sure they're fully informed, making sure they can make an informed decision about whether this is the right job for them. We're also then responsible for their welfare while they're here in the UK, and that is to look at the workplace, the accommodation, the pay, the treatment by the farm itself. And as a sponsor, we're actually legally obligated to manage those things. Because it's a seasonal worker scheme, we're also moving workers around the UK, multiple farms, multiple jobs at various times of the year. I think this year we're coming back to something more like normal, and apologies to everybody, both my colleagues and clients if I've jinxed it. We're sort of heading back to about 65% returnee rate, which is what we expected sort of pre-Brexit and pre-losing the Ukrainian supply chain. One of the risks that came out of that significant shift to new source countries was the risk of exploitation by actors outside of the supply chain. And there were a number of other risks, but in response to those risks, the seasonal worker stakeholders came together, growers, retailers, NGOs, scheme operators, as well as government departments, to look at how do we manage some of those risks. So one of the things that we've did over the period of 2023 was to really look at worker education. You know, that's vitally important to being able to get workers to make a good decision, because that's what we're reliant on a lot of the time. We of course tell them when they come to see us at recruitment events, don't pay fees, you don't need to pay these other actors. We tell them online, we tell them on our website, we tell them on social media channels. If they don't know who we are, it's already too late. So we have to expand out that messaging. So one of the things that the task force did was to build on the Just Good Work app, to bespoke it to the seasonal worker scheme. And that project had started before the task force, but the task force was really able to put expert opinion into that. This year, we've had over 24,000 downloads of the Just Good Work app, which means that we're really getting some traction and people are really accessing it. And we also work with the IOM to write pre-departure training, and Matt from Proforce touched on that yesterday, to make sure workers are accessing this information. But I think one thing that the task force really did was to bring those people together, because of that need for an individual to make a good decision. If the messaging isn't consistent, we're part of the problem. So kind of over that period, we really looked at, you know, how do we, you know, best inform workers and enable them to make sort of the right decision. I think one of the other things that we then started to really look at was how workers experience the on-farm period in the UK. The recruitment is just the start of that journey. And then they go to a UK farm, and UK farms are not experts in legislation. They're not experts in, you know, all these human rights due diligence processes. They grow stuff so that we can eat. You know, that's their primary function. And we've then introduced to them this really complicated visa scheme with all these new risks in all these new source countries where culturally things are different. And so one of the other projects that the task force really looked at was building capacity in that end user space, so that the end employer. And that was delivered through a number of road shows, both in person or in real life, as it's called nowadays, and online. And it managed to reach sort of 400 plus individuals. And we think there's about 300 farms sort of participating in the scheme. So, you know, it really did have very good traction. And some of the sort of responses to that are that, you know, growers really felt better informed, better able to make, you know, the worker experience really enjoyable and profitable. You know, migrant workers are here to earn money and improve their living conditions at home. The other thing that was a real challenge is access to data. DEFRA run a survey of the seasonal worker scheme, and in 2022, response rate was about 14%, so a reasonable sort of survey. And some of the numbers that came out of that were pretty good. 91% were pretty happy with their recruitment experience, with the information they were provided. 85% plus were happy with the majority of aspects of working on farm. So some really good things. Some things to work on, such as access to grievance mechanisms and then the response to those grievance mechanisms. And while those data points are really good, the challenge was we didn't receive that data until January 2024. Mm-hmm. So the issues being raised in 2022 are coming to us 12 months plus later. So one of the key projects of the task force right now is to build an independent worker survey that will be distributed by scheme operators to all workers. And hopefully that provides us with the ability to get real live data that is not subject to a political process for release. And if built correctly and supported correctly, it'll actually enable us to see, by scheme operator, by farm, what are the real challenges, and therefore we can react to it. I think as organizations, we all want to do something. We all want to do better. But if you don't really know what you're trying to improve, those things are really difficult to manage. I'm conscious of time. And I think we'll come back to the responsible recruitment toolkit maybe a little bit later on. The other key project that's sort of in play right now for the task force is some economic modelling of employer pays principle. So as scheme operators, we don't charge work-finding fees, whether in the UK or overseas. It's not to say that the risk of exploitation doesn't exist, but we are not charging work-finding fees. But the worker is currently paying for their own visa and travel to the UK, so we've not fully embedded employer pays principle. Employer pays principle costs money, and there's a need to really understand what is the impact, what's the impact on food prices. If we make UK produce too expensive, does the production just go abroad? And if it goes abroad, is the worker earning less? Are they being mistreated? Are we creating more problems, more unintended consequences by trying to do something really very good? So I think they're the key things that the task force has been working on over the last 12, 18 months.
Great, thank you, James. And yeah, I look forward to pushing you on some of those points throughout the session. If we go to Henriette next, if you could talk about what risks that you've identified in the work that you've been doing around the recruitment of migrant workers in the Gulf region and Southeast Asia, and then kind of similar to James, how has industry responded to those risks?
Yeah. I think that this is a room full of experts who are already aware about the risks, so I'm not going to bore you out with the risks, and I'm going to bore you with what led us to our response to these risks, namely our Fair Recruitment Toolkit, which we published last September with the coalition B4IG, which has now merged into WBCSD. And specifically how this toolkit was the fruit of a kind of failure, but a failure that may prove useful to you and to businesses and actors around the room. So first, a little bit about what led Vinci to work on fair recruitment. Vinci hires 280,000 employees worldwide in its concessions, energy, and construction projects. And while the vast majority of our employees are local, and we have only a very small minority who are migrant workers, the recruitment of workers, and specifically migrant workers, is an issue for us, as has been identified in our Vinci Guide on Human Rights. And it certainly has been a salient issue in Qatar, where Vinci has designed and built large infrastructure projects, and in which I worked 6 years as a CSR manager. And at its peak, QDVC had 5,000 direct workers, and that reached 15,000, counting all our supply chain, subcontractors, and manpower providers. And while today QDVC is finishing its last project in Qatar, Vinci still has a few operations in the Gulf, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and generally around the world, including in Europe. Our project pulled many different nationalities, many different profiles, including foreign workers and including migrant workers. So that's how we sort of got into it. So what was our journey and what led Vinci to develop this toolkit? we discovered a few years ago, 2014, that 90% of our workers in Qatar had paid recruitment fees in their countries of origin to agencies and intermediaries to migrate to Qatar. So the first step was to reinforce our due diligence processes and to do a zero-fee policy in practice and to invest a lot more in the fair recruitment of our direct workers. And then the next step was our supply chain. And we did that mainly, more or less successfully, through labor rights audits, which included workers' interviews, but mainly through a partnership that we did with the ILO, a fair recruitment pilot project in the construction sector, in which we embarked our major manpower provider along the way, and they did embark their recruitment agency in Bangladesh. And that pilot project consisted of an initial in-depth assessment that was done by Verité. Then we did some extensive capacity building with all actors around the room, which took a long year, many sessions in Dhaka, Doha, etc. And then involved the interviews of hundreds of workers in an impact assessment in which we compared a control group with a treatment group. And with that pilot, we reached very similar positive results than what we had done with our direct workers, because 93% of the recruited workers did not pay a single fee through the pilot, and the remaining 7% saw their average fee drop from more than $3,000 to less than 300. So that was a good step, but the next question was, okay, now how do we deploy internally within Vinci this approach and our experience and our learnings and beyond Qatar? And this is what we tried to do with the coalition B4IG, Business to Tackle Inequality. And we analyzed that the keys of success of the ILO project had been to bring many actors around the room. And this is what we tried to do with the B4IG Human Rights Group. So it was Vinci, Unilever, L'Oréal, Schneider Electric, Sodexo, Mars, and Danone getting together to identify a common neighboring country, the UAE. And we started to look for a local partner to replicate the Qatar pilot project, but this time in the UAE. And that's when the challenges began. I think it was after COVID, and I don't think the top priority of our suppliers and manpower providers was fair recruitment. Even though there was the World Expo in Dubai, there was not the same pressure as in Qatar in the preparation of the World Cup, not the same dynamic between the government and international institutions, just not the same momentum. So while we managed to identify some common suppliers among our companies to do this project, we met some fairly motivated branch managers, but they did not manage to convince their top management, or we did not manage to convince their top management. And after a few calls, many visios, we either got a polite decline or just no news. So we spent months trying to look for the right partner, the right supplier to do this pilot project with us. And after many months, we reached a year, and we realized that our initial project to replicate the pilot project was not going to happen. So we had to reformat our project, and the outcome of which, the main deliverable of which became the Fair Recruitment Toolkit. With one mantra, which was, let's not reinvent the wheel. We know and we knew that there's already a lot of guidance on the subject. So what we looked at was to provide what was potentially missing for practitioners on the ground, using the experience that we had built since 2014 along our journey. So our toolkit, the Fair Recruitment Toolkit for employers and service providers, has three main characteristics. It's sector agnostic, it's open source, and it's been tested with, it comes from the years of experience that Vinci and its partners have had in the region with proven results. So quickly, what is it concretely? Well, this is a reminder of the different steps of the migrant workers' journey and the potential costs for the workers, which you all know. And now, what the toolkit proposes for all the companies who want to recruit migrant workers and to embark their suppliers on the journey are the tools to avoid said costs. So I'm just going to take a few examples. What does a local fair recruitment policy look like? Well, you can download one. If you want to know if a recruitment agency is actually implementing fair recruitment or if it's just lip service, the toolkit proposes an investigation checklist with all the questions that needs to be asked. If you suspect that one of your suppliers could have workers in a situation of bonded labor, a recruitment fee investigation form is available to interview their employees. And those tools can be used either in pre-qualification, as a sort of self-assessment, or as audit form. And if you download the whole toolkit, you'll have access to very simple checklists of, to make sure that no major aspects are overlooked along the way. So, for lack of finding a trusted common supplier, we decided to share our return of experience and practical tools with as many companies and suppliers as possible. So, in a nutshell, here's our journey. I think it's a little bit early to talk about positive impact, but please implement it, see it for yourself, and next year we can compare notes.
Thank you, and thank you for your honesty as well with those challenges. I think it builds really nicely from the previous session around where we bring that openness and honesty to these sessions. We get so much more out of them, so appreciate that, and yeah, look forward to some follow-ups there. Last but not least, Deeva, it would be great if you could share the risks that Waitrose as a retailer has identified in your own operations and supply chains. And perhaps you could share about how you've been working collaboratively in the sector with your suppliers to promote and support responsible recruitment. Just a nice small question there.
Definitely. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. So my name's Deeva. I work at the John Lewis Partnership. For those that don't know, John Lewis Partnership is a UK co-owned business, the largest of its kind in the UK. And within that, we have two brands. So we have Waitrose, which is our food and grocery brand. And then we also have John Lewis, which is our general merchandise and fashion brand. And I'm lucky enough in my role to look at both of our brands. So you'll get a little bit from both sides today. So when we look at salient risks, what we do is each year we really come together as a team to collaborate and bring ideas together on what we think our current risks are, but what also are the risks that we see upcoming for the next 12 months, 24 months, and possibly a little bit beyond that if we feel like we have the right insight. And where do we bring that information from? Well, multiple resources. So we'll always start with collaborating with NGOs that we always tend to work with, some that may reach out to us through many different means, and some that are just generally talking within the space, and we're doing our own horizon scanning to understand what salient risks they're identifying and whether or not we're seeing that in our supply base. And then we will triangulate that with many other data sources. So as many of you are probably aware, we have a due diligence program, and most retailers do. So we'll use information from that. And then we'll also look at other information from other brands working in the same space as us, and also government bodies, because they're a great resource to understand what they'll be talking about within the space, but also some of that more locale information that as a primarily UK-based team that we don't always get the insight of. In addition to that, we also have industry forums, but that closely aligns with the other NGOs. So FNET is one that we work very closely with. That's the Food Network for Ethical Trade, Stronger Together, and of course, Ethical Trading Initiative. When we do this, we obviously come back with quite a lot of risks. So we have an exercise that we do inside the team to look at the saliency of that, and we kind of look at likelihood and a few other factors in there as well. And we will start to draft a list. So this year we've got risks in a lot of areas, but what we try to do is to frame them back within the ETI base code. So getting a bit technical here, but for those that don't know, the ETI base code is an industry-wide sort of set of principles that we look at to ensure labour standards. And when we present them back, we use the same terminology. So there's 9 ETI base code principles. And just a few of those are employment freely chosen, collective bargaining and freedom of association, child labour, health and safety. And then we will align our salient risks to those and also to the supply chain that we're talking about. So a few examples from this year. So within employment freely chosen, we've identified the seasonal worker scheme within the UK as a salient risk area. I'm sure James has touched upon why. And then we're also looking a little bit at wild fishing within the UK as well. Freedom of association, we've got a little bit more further afield, so we've identified that China is a salient risk for us, especially within the general merchandise space, and then with also within the wages industry. We have bananas within the Dominican Republic, which you might see a lot of retailers talking about at the moment with some commitments there. How do we look at addressing these salient risks? Again, through a variety of means, but responsible recruitment in itself, we have quite direct ways that we look at that, and primarily it is through Stronger Together and responsible recruitment, because we find it's a really great tool to engage the supply base, but also to follow up with that and be able to track and monitor progress that they're making against that. So my task over the last 3 years, I've been in my role for 3 years, was about improving engagement of our supply base, primarily on the Waitrose side, because Waitrose is a bit more familiar with Stronger Together. But how do we look at really getting suppliers to understand responsible recruitment, but also then go above and beyond and start really engaging and doing a little bit more and not just assessing where they're at, not just doing those core trainings. We decided, and I know some people in this room might not be a big fan, but we decided to use policy to do that. We obviously didn't want to just have it as a one point of interaction. We didn't want someone to just go to the training and say, that's it, I'm clued up on responsible recruitment. So we really kind of sat back and thought about how best to engage beyond that initial point of engagement. And again, we use Stronger Together to do this. So they have a fantastic sort of promotion which they do with their suppliers, and they call them business partners. And what that basically demonstrates is that supplier has attended lots of trainings. They've completed the progress reporting toolkit, which I won't go into too much detail about, but they've really spent the time to understand what's going on within their own recruitment channels, what's going on a little bit with their supply base as well, but where are those gaps and what are those next points that they can look at within the next 12 months. And once they do that repeatedly, they get this business partner status, and Stronger Together give them lots of kind of fun stuff to do with that status, and ways to also, again, learn, share, and share bits of knowledge as well. And that's what we decided to include in our policy. So we've mandated the core trainings because that is an aspect of getting to business partner status. But what we've put in there is some really nice initiatives and some incentives as well to get to that business partner status, because we know how much sit behind it. And we know that it's not, as I said, going to be that singular point of contact. It's going to be something that they have to uphold all the time. But on our side as Waitrose, we are giving them incentives to do that as well. And I think that's a really nice balance point about how do you kind of move from policy to implementation. And it is about finding those nuances of, yes, policy does work. I mean, it's not the nicest thing to always talk about, but it does work, and it is well communicated, and people do understand what policy means. So it's getting a bit creative with that, and how do we go a little bit beyond that, but also still talk in the terminologies that our supply base are aware of, and to be quite honest, take seriously with our area of work, because human rights is fairly new within the field. We see a lot more attention on our technical policies. So again, it's a nice way to drive engagement beyond that. Beyond policy, though, we do some other interesting bits. I don't just talk about policy. So we have quite a few supply chain initiatives. And I think some of the talks we've listened to about scaling that up has been really, really interesting. Because I think that is something that we struggle with, or we always try to learn more about how to scale, what's the best way to put yourself in a position to be able to scale. And just some of the projects that we've got going on at the moment. So we have 2 projects going on, one in Malaysia and one in Thailand, with some of our suppliers. So the one in Thailand it was an ambient supplier, and one of the main focus points of that project is looking at recruitment principles. So they've just managed to actually make quite a bit of progress with their supply base, and we're now looking at what principles can we put in place to really make sure that they follow through with that. Some of the supply base are looking at the possibility of walk-in recruitment, and again, really ensuring that we put them in the best place to be able to do that responsibly and ethically. In Malaysia, slightly different, really looking at kind of embedding responsible recruitment within the site, ensuring trainings and capacity building across management, and also weeding out some of the behaviour that we have seen at site that we wouldn't expect to be there, or we wouldn't like within the future of the site as well. So a bit more reactive, where we see Thailand is a bit more proactive, but again, just 2 different ways that we are working with supply base, where we either think there may be risk or we have identified it already. We have some work within the UK within responsible recruitment as well, but again, it's a completely different way of engaging our supply base. So in this area, we have partnered with 2 different NGOs within the space, so Slave Free Alliance and the Unseen Network, to work with our furniture suppliers. And this was, again, a different way of approaching it, and we only included responsible recruitment as an element of that workshop. But it got great traction, lots of questions, and off the back of that, we now know what areas of responsible recruitment our UK supply base would kind of benefit most from further development or further engagement on, whether or not be a development. So lots of different ways that we engage, and as I said, we are always looking for kind of more initiatives on how to scale up. But I think something that we have learned is when you sort of prioritise the initial stage of the project to be something that can be scaled, it does help a lot more. Some of the projects that we have previously, very specific to a locale, and as you're saying, sometimes it doesn't always work to transfer something that's worked in one geography to another, and that's something that we are learning at the moment. So we have a few other projects going on slightly outside of recruitment, but really helping us to learn what it takes to be able to scale a project up and put ourselves in a better situation for that. I think I've hit all my points. Only other one I've just hit on is we also just starting our work with the responsible fishing vessel. So again, a little bit more Waitrose side. And within there, we'll also start to look at responsible recruitment as well. So again, just another point of how we are trying to weed it into different ongoing projects, up and coming ones, but look at it from a multifaceted point of view. One type of project will not work with this. All of our supply base are in different positions. So being flexible with that, while also having that underlying policy requirement. So yeah, quite a few things going on.
Thank you, Deeva. Yeah, sounds like you've got an awful lot on your to-do list. But yeah, really great to hear, and I was really interested that we're kind of moving into the question we're seeking to address around how do we scale the initiatives that we've heard over the last day and a half. So I get a bit of chair's privilege now with some follow-up questions, but a reminder to please submit questions to our great speakers. James, I was going to come to you first, and I think kind of particularly building on Deeva's points there around how UK retailers are collaborating through the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit and Consumer Goods Programme. I was just wondering if you could share a bit more about how this has kind of enabled you as a labour provider to access resources, capacity building, and to start to address some of those risks that were coming out in both yours and Deeva's opening remarks there.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I think having a platform that's pre-built is super useful. In the environment that we work in, which is food production, which is often, very last minute. We work with a visa process that is often very last minute. It's really good to have something that is there, it already exists, and we can just start mapping what we do against what's already been delivered for us in terms of assessment of best practice, and it's put in a really nice environment that we can do as a self-assessment process in our own time around all the other things that we have to do as a business on a day-to-day basis. I think it also enables us to present ourselves to the industry as someone who's responsible, who is taking these things seriously, and we hope that then brings commercial benefit. A lot of these things come about because a lot of us, particularly those people in the room today and watching online, have an inherent desire to do good. That's why we do the jobs that we do. But eventually you have to have a business case. and the ability to demonstrate to retailers and to our client base in the farming industry that we're approaching these things, you know, in a really, really direct fashion, you know, is super useful. Over the last 6 months, we've gone a little bit further than that. So the self-assessment tool is wonderful, but again, it is us looking introspectively at our own business and deciding whether we're doing good things or not. And after a while, you look at things and you think, of course we're doing good things, because that's what we've been doing for a while now. And so over the last 6 months, we've been through what's called a responsible recruitment progress assessment. And so that is an independent assessor coming into our business to assess us against those self-assessment standards. And I think that's been, again, just layering on that capacity that has enabled us to push on again to find additional things we can do in our business, and then to go on to demonstrate further to the sector that we supply that we're taking this stuff seriously. I think it always comes back to that business case, though. And that's a real challenge, particularly in the seasonal worker scheme, because of the way that the visa allocation is delivered. You're given your allocation, and regardless of how well you perform, that's your allocation, and so it limits your growth. And so the business case has to then be about, well, you know, are we protected from significant changes in the global environment? You know, COVID, we reduced our ability to recruit face-to-face. We lost the Ukraine supply chain. We had to go to these new countries. If we can achieve a base level of really good compliance, then as a business, we're able to react to these, what seem to be more frequent global challenges.
Great, thank you. And Henriette, similar to the seasonal worker scheme and, you know, what James was highlighting there, you've obviously got experience of focusing on that in-depth kind of continuous improvement with kind of a small number of labour providers and agencies. And I just wondered if you could expand on the benefits and challenges of that approach from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Well, by necessity, it's always easier to start with the small number of labour providers and agencies. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink if it's not thirsty, so you need motivated actors. What has worked in the Qatar case was that we had already started to build a relationship with our manpower provider for 4 or 5 years before they hopped on board with us with the ILO project. And that was done through inspections, audit, through engagement, really. But what's challenging in driving impact at scale, I was about to say everything. Everything is challenging. But the very fact that you need to start with a minimal number of motivated actors is a big challenge in itself. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it's only a few actors. Then, let's be honest, there's still a lack of demand from responsible actors in the private sector. I'd say a third challenge for Vinci is our sector in itself. The fact that it's a project-based activity means that we almost have to start from scratch in each project, in each country. So that's an added difficulty. And, well, there's one possible course of action, the challenge of which is that it's time-consuming. But one thing I've noticed works was to bring our top management to do some workers' interviews. Obviously, you can't do it every time, and you can't bring everyone. But believe it or not, we have some directors who've been in the region for years, if not decades, and who still have no idea what's going on. I mean, they obviously have an idea of what's going on in terms of their business, in health and safety, in working conditions, social protection, accommodation. But the issue of forced labor and recruitment fees in the countries of origin can be off their radar. And so if they see it with their own eyes, it can have an impact, especially if it happens in their own perimeter. So unlike the popular saying, you know, seeing is believing, actually seeing is understanding. And so time-consuming, yes, necessary, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point around that accountability and hearts and minds. And yeah, we find in Stronger Together those stories and those personal case studies are just the thing that always cuts through. And then, but
it's sad sometimes. I mean, I wish it could be done, you know, in a training or in a conference or just by having a conversation, but it actually takes a lot more.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think one thing that you touched on, which again kind of comes back to our big question, is that challenge in driving the impact to scale that you would want to see. So I wonder, James, if you could reflect on whether you've felt similar challenges in the UK seasonal worker scheme, in that, you know, initially it's those kind of smaller kind of projects, and then what are the challenges to scale that up?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just I suppose going to that point I made earlier about, having, that small number of willing individuals is half the battle. But in actual fact, like with hard work, you can usually find them, and they do exist. But then you realize not everyone's like that. And then that becomes a real challenge, because what you have to do is make this stuff the norm, because that's the way you bring the horse to water.
Carrying on the analogy.
to carry on the analogy. And I think that's where, so, if you take the Seasonal Worker Scheme Task Force, I think it's reasonably rare to have so many people from top to bottom in a supply chain in the same conversation. And I think that's super useful, because, it actually enables us to really, talk openly, really understand the issues and the challenges and risks, and therefore present solutions which are actually going to resolve that, as opposed to something that's done from afar. But then, how do you get over that? How do you then get everybody to make sure you're sort of accepting that that's the new norm, and that's how people are expected to behave? And I think that's where there's an element of kind of that procurement element, the individuals that are choosing the suppliers, the people at the top of the supply chain that can influence those other actors in their supply chain to make other decisions. And I think you have to show best practice, you have to create the tools, you have to make it the new norm, then you have to influence and kind of exert pressure in some cases. But then you also have to accept that not everybody's going to want to do those things, and then as an industry we have a decision to make. How do we behave, and what do we do in those cases?
Yeah, how do we get rid of those energy vampires so you can get on with the good stuff? Yeah, thank you for that. And Deeva, obviously we've heard a lot of kind of new risks that have emerged over the last few years. So new visa routes, Ukraine, COVID, cost of living crisis has kind of come up in our conversations. And I think one thing that really stood out from your opening remarks is obviously you partner with a lot of NGOs, and clearly that's an important part of you understanding risks. But I wondered if there was anything else that you yourself or as an organisation do to stay on top of those new and emerging risks. What's the kind of magic ball that you can look into and get the next risk kind of underhand?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, no magic ball. It's a lot about, as I say, engagement with all actors in the supply chain, all stakeholders. And it's a bit of a poor answer, but I would say industry forums are really the space to do that. So being here, meeting people, attending regular meetings with some of those organisations that I've already said have been fundamental to us understanding. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we were in Spain as a group of retailers with our fresh produce supply base. And again, talking to suppliers there, you're learning lots more about the things that you just don't learn through being able to go through a SMETA report or a self-assessment questionnaire. And then also using the resources that we do have on the ground. So Waitrose, John, is fairly small brands. We don't have in-country representatives everywhere, but our technical managers are pretty much the eyes and ears that we have on the ground. And I guess to both of your points, having them engage in the conversation, having them aware of what human rights risks are, what does modern slavery look like, what is responsible recruitment, has again allowed us to learn a lot more about our supply chain, which you probably wouldn't have learnt elsewhere. And again, you do find those really engaged technical managers that then push their supply chain to do more, to do better, to go further, and again develops our relations with those suppliers as well. So we have some really big suppliers that suddenly, not within my time, but you see their own human rights teams opening up and their own sustainability teams, and all of this kind of engagement and deeper understanding helps us to understand risk, helps them to understand risk, and ultimately allows us to be a better collaborative group of stakeholders because we are communicating more. But yeah, beyond that, no magic ball, unfortunately, but I would say definitely staying on top of the other brands and the other NGOs within the space has been our biggest
It's a really good point about the eyes and ears on the ground as well, that those individuals may not be in human rights roles, but how can you kind of empower them to keep track of what's happening. Great, so I'm conscious of time, so I do still have some questions, but I should probably open up to a more democratic form. So Bonnie, I don't know if there is any specific questions. this stage.
Yes, hi, and I'm not touching the mics. So we had a lot of questions. I think I'll start with a broad one, Bethan, and then there's some more looking at the details of what were raised in your individual presentations. So there was one interesting audience question on, mindful of the fact that we're looking at industry, how industry is dealing with the risk of responsible recruitment. Is there a divergence between the state perception of this risk versus how the industry is looking at this risk? And then we had one comment applauding Henriette on how much you have done for the Vinci tool. And then as a follow-up to that, can you talk to us about how widely hasn't been adopted? Anything that you could share, I think would be welcomed. And then a question to James on this UK scheme. Is it paid by the employer? Is it all government paid? And have you encountered cases of workers showing up in the farms due to fraudulent recruitments and saying that it was not matching the contract that they were promised in their country of origin? If you have cases like that, can you talk about it and the ways that you have taken to address them?
Great.
Just 3 easy ones, right?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, from the UK perspective, I guess I can already kind of sense there is, some challenges that we've had with working with the state and the public sector on the UK seasonal workers scheme without preempting too much what either one of you may want to say. I don't know if either one of you wants to kick off with that.
We're a licensed government sponsor, so I have to tread carefully here. I wouldn't say the state is diverging in terms of the risks, in terms of here in the UK at least. I think one of the challenges we have is the speed of movement in wanting to deal with and address those risks. We work with a couple of government departments and getting them to the table has been reasonably challenging. And I also think in the UK we have quite a difficult conversation about migration at the moment. Because the way that it is presented is a sort of a wholesale view of this is migration and it is X or it is Y. And so again, sort of trying to cut through the political challenges of discussing migration is pretty challenging. I think we're getting there. We are getting better dialogue. But I also think that private enterprise is stepping in to fill the void. If you look at the sponsor's obligations, they're state-like in terms of making sure a work environment is safe, checking accommodation is suitable and meeting criteria and requirements, checking that workers are being paid appropriately and receiving minimum wage and receiving pay for all hours, checking they're receiving the right protective equipment, checking that that their welfare is in as it should be. So I think these are all pretty much state-like responsibilities, and so we're filling the void. And similarly with some of the the activities of the task force, they exist because we have to move quicker. And if that's the way it has to be, then I'm fine with that because we have to move quicker.
Great, thank you. And Henriette, your second question was specifically around the tool, and I don't know if any of that just resonated with you around moving quick and clearly putting out a really useful resource to address those risks.
Yeah. About the toolkit, well, let's make things clear. It's one tool among others. It's not the only one. I think it's important to emphasize on the importance of the obvious principle that we need to have this conversation about the true cost of fair recruitment at top executive level, and how this price needs to be integrated in the way that we tender, the different tenders we work on, and in the way that we select our suppliers and subcontractors. I think this is overarching. And then about the toolkit, I think it's a little bit early to talk about how widely it's been accepted. We're deployed. We're slowly but surely starting to advertise it. This is the first step. But it's part of a key element that we believe in, that we actually need to build capacity locally and regionally. And this is what we have started to do, well, with the publication of the toolkit, but also by organizing some local workshops. We did our first one last month in the UAE. We finally did something in the UAE, where we gathered 35 practitioners from 18 different companies, among which there were a few Vinci subsidiaries and some partners and their suppliers, and some of our suppliers as well. And the toolkit was all around awareness around fair recruitment, but also how to get grips with the toolkit. We did some role play, we did some fake audits and interviews, etc. And actually all the participants were practitioners. We had some general managers, some construction managers, some CSR, human rights officers, who are all, from a day-to-day basis, recruiting, employing migrant workers as part of their operation, either directly or indirectly. So I think and I hope that we got the target right. And then the next step, we really hope to organize the next workshop in Southeast Asia before the end of the year or beginning of next year. We want to do some impact assessment post-workshop, and we're currently developing an e-learning to reach even more practitioners.
Great, so watch this space.
But we're at the beginning, I would say.
Yeah. And maybe an invitation for you to come back next year and give us an update on how it's all going.
Or in 2 years.
I don't have the power to do that, but I'm just going to say it. And then the last question was around kind of fraud and kind of fake job advertisements. And knowing a little bit from the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, I know that that is an issue that's rising kind of in the UK, people turning up and job doesn't exist, it's a kind of fake advert. So I'm not, James, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's probably two distinct elements to the problem, and they have different solutions in my opinion. So there is one where the worker has been to a bona fide recruitment event, they've been given detailed information, they've also, really importantly, been informed quite clearly that this is the reality. This is, work in agriculture is super tough. It rains in the UK a lot. Retailer orders change, the volume of crop changes, when it needs to be picked changes, there is disease, there's all these factors that can influence and change what was intended. And the way the visa scheme works is that we're processing individuals about 14 weeks prior to arrival, and so the information is delivered at that point, but 14 weeks in agriculture is a very long time and a lot can change. So, to tackle that, we really just need to be very clear with people what they're signing up to, and make sure that's understood, which is quite often the harder element. I've spent quite a lot of time in Central Asia over the last 18 months and been at recruitment events where we've had maybe 200 people in a room and delivering a presentation about what the job is, and everybody in the room will hear something slightly different. Working hours in the UK are between 32 hours and up to 60 hours. And someone will say, 32 hours, that's amazing, I'll do that and I love that. And someone will say, 60 hours is too much, it's not for me. Others will say, 60 hours is what I want every week. They won't hear the average is 42. So I think that's really important about how do we deal with that. And then there is this other element that I think we're seeing sort of more often, and it's not just a migration issue. There's quite a big challenge in the UK of UK-based individuals applying to jobs that don't exist in the UK, or even in some cases doing work for a period of time and then finding out they're not going to get paid because the job doesn't exist. So, I think there's some real challenges. I think with the visa scheme, those obviously are potentially heightened because of the egg being so golden. Probably the best way to describe it. We heard from Matt at Proforce yesterday talking about this 15 to 20x in terms of kind of difference in earnings. The desire to get into the scheme is so huge, and as operators, we need to understand that and mitigate that risk as much as we possibly can.
Great. So I'm conscious that we've got 5 minutes left, and I think it would be a really nice ending if each of you could share a key lesson that you'd share with anyone in the room. You can pick it up over lunch. Anyone seeking to collaborate on mitigating risks. And if you want to tell me when you're ready, so I'm not.
Happy to start, yeah. I can see everyone looking at me. So I would say that the biggest lesson that we have is to really take the time at the beginning to understand, especially when collaborating, the shared risks that you have. And they might be sort of actual risk within the supply chain. It might be this actual supply chain that you are sharing. it might be previous work that you've both done within the space. I know we've spoken about reinventing the wheel a few times as well. But really taking that time at the beginning to understand truly where you can collaborate and truly where those areas of risk are definitely set you up a lot better for kind of subsequent work, and really getting to the root of the issue as well. Because I think, again, what we see a lot, especially within this point within the supermarket industry, is we are starting to see some of the issues that were previously maybe reducing, starting to arise, or some other areas that we want to start focusing on again, and really taking that time to check in at the beginning to understand what has been done, understand where we can collaborate with shared supply chains to go further, has allowed us to do a lot more. It's allowed us to go deeper into the supply chains. It's allowed us to be honest, to get more funding to do certain bits. So, but really taking that time at the beginning has just been invaluable to us. And when we haven't been able to take the time, and we have had to go in, very reactive off the back of something, we've ended up realising that we probably need to go back again, or maybe a second phase of work. And I think that takes away sometimes from what you really can do in that first stage, especially when it's collaborative and you have the leverage that many of us in the room do when we power together.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if there's one thing we've learned from our experience, it's the fact that this is a complex issue, and therefore we need some, it cannot suffer improvisation. So I think that it's really important to have dedicated resources, human resources, especially in countries where human rights are at risk, especially when we rely on migrant workers. It's vital to recruit more CSR, human rights, worker welfare, sustainability, no matter what you want to call them, specialists. And just like health and safety has become central in our industry, and it's a reflex that nobody questions anymore, I'd really like if human rights could take the same direction. But I think it is. I think it will. And so yeah, let's try and collaborate to pull our actions where our words are.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think very, very similar. I think what I've seen over the last 4 years have been major shifts in the UK economy, whether that is Brexit and the single biggest change to trading history possibly in my lifetime, although that might change, who knows. And then global pandemics, and then war on European soil. I think, as I said earlier, build your capacity. Build it early, build it when times are good, because there is going to be something that you didn't know was coming. And to do that, you must collaborate. You have to be willing to talk, to be open, and to listen. Because you'll find people that are better at this stuff than you, and you can really draw on that, and you can make your own business better.
Great. Well, I don't think I can finish with a better note, to be honest. So yeah, thank you so much to the three of you for sharing so generously. It was a really interesting session, and yeah, please do kind of grab us over the lunch breaks, and yeah, on to the next session. Well done, everyone. Good job.